The vast emptiness of space shimmered as reality itself seemed to tear open, revealing the massive hull of the Dominion's edge as it emerged from the hyperspace corridor. Commander Zephyrak stood motionless on the bridge, his crystalline eyes reflecting the pale blue glow of Earth hanging like a jewel against the cosmic darkness. Behind him, the rest of the hegemony fleet materialized one by one, 300 vessels of war, each one capable of reducing a planet to ash. "Target acquired, Commander," reported Navigator Tyson, her voice carrying the mechanical precision that marked her species. The biomechanical implants along her skull pulsed with data streams as she processed the information flooding their sensors. Preliminary scans indicate approximately 8 billion inhabitants across the primary landmasses. Technological level appears to be primitive. Zephyrak's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. In his 3 centuries of conquest, he had seen dozens of worlds fall before the hegemony's might. This blue-green marble would be no different. The species that called themselves humans had barely reached beyond their own moon, their weapons still relied on chemical propulsion, and their societies remained fractured into competing nation-states. It would be a harvest, nothing more. "Weapons Officer Kexith," Zephyrak commanded, his voice resonating through the bridge's crystalline walls. "Begin the demonstration. Target their largest population centers with precision strikes. We want survivors to witness their helplessness." Kexith's 4 arms danced across the weapon controls with practiced efficiency. "Plasma batteries charging, Commander. Shall I target their military installations first?" "No." Zephyrak's eyes never left the planet below. "Target their monuments, their symbols of pride. Let them watch as everything they believe makes them special crumbles to dust. Only then will they understand the futility of resistance." Far below on Earth's surface, Admiral Kalen Thorne stood in the depths of NORAD, watching the tactical displays with growing dread. The alien vessels had appeared without warning, their energy signatures unlike anything in human databases. Initial attempts at communication had been met with silence, and now those same vessels were moving into attack positions. "Sir," called out Captain Xylia Voss from the communication station, her usually steady voice betraying a tremor of fear. "We're receiving reports from observatories worldwide. The alien fleet, it's massive. Our preliminary count suggests over 300 capital ships, each one larger than anything we've ever built." Thorne's weathered hands gripped the edge of the command table as he processed the magnitude of what they faced. At 62 he had dedicated his life to preparing for theoretical conflicts, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this moment. The weight of 8 billion lives pressed down on his shoulders like a mountain. "Have we heard anything from the other world leaders?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Emergency Council is convening, but sir." Voss hesitated, her dark eyes reflecting the grim reality they all understood. "What can we possibly do against technology that advanced? Our most powerful weapons would barely scratch their hull plating." Before Thorne could respond, the first plasma beam lanced down from orbit. The Statue of Liberty vanished in a pillar of superheated light, the very atoms of the copper and steel torn apart and scattered to the wind. Within minutes, similar strikes reached out across the globe. The Eiffel Tower, Big Ben, the Christ the Redeemer statue in Rio, the Great Wall of China, humanity's greatest monuments disappeared in moments, leaving only glowing craters and the acrid smell of vaporized stone. In the small farming community of Cedar Falls, Iowa, Mira Salas pulled her daughter close as they watched the terrible light show on the horizon. The local news had gone silent an hour ago, replaced by an emergency broadcast signal that repeated the same message: "Remain calm. Seek shelter. Do not attempt to flee." "Mama, what's happening?" whispered 7-year-old Elena, her small hands clutching her mother's work-worn fingers. Mira didn't have an answer. She was just a nurse at the local clinic, a woman who had never traveled more than 100 miles from where she was born. But as she looked up at the night sky, now illuminated by the alien fleet's running lights, she felt something stirring deep within her chest. It wasn't fear, though that was certainly present. It wasn't despair, though the situation seemed hopeless. It was something else entirely, a quiet, burning determination that surprised her with its intensity. Whatever was coming, whatever these beings intended for her world and her daughter, they would find that humanity was not the helpless prey they expected. Mira might not understand the technology or the politics or the grand strategies that would unfold in the coming days, but she understood one thing with perfect clarity: she would fight for every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of her daughter's future. The conquest of Earth was about to begin, but the aliens would soon discover that conquering a world and breaking its people were two very different things. The emergency session of the United Nations had been hastily relocated to a bunker complex beneath Geneva, where representatives from every major nation huddled around holographic displays showing the devastation above. The air recycling systems hummed constantly, unable to fully mask the scent of fear and desperation that permeated the confined space. Admiral Thorne stood before the assembly, his uniform crisp despite the circumstances, his voice carrying across the chamber with military precision. Ladies and gentlemen, we face an enemy whose technological superiority is absolute. Our conventional forces have been rendered obsolete before the first shot was fired. However, this does not mean we are without options. The Russian representative, Minister Volkov, leaned forward in his chair. Admiral, with respect, what options could we possibly have? They destroyed our most iconic landmarks as if they were made of paper. Their shields deflect our most powerful missiles like raindrops. They want something from us, Thorne replied, his eyes scanning the faces before him. If their goal was simple extermination, they could have sterilized the planet from orbit within hours. The fact that they're taking time to demonstrate their power suggests they want us alive, at least some of us. That gives us leverage. On the Dominion's edge, Commander Zephyrak reviewed the initial strike reports with satisfaction. The primitive species below had ceased their pathetic attempts at resistance after witnessing the destruction of their monuments. Their communication networks buzzed with panic and surrender negotiations, exactly as predicted by the hegemony's xenopsychologists. Commander, Tyson reported, we're receiving multiple transmission attempts from the planet's surface. Shall I establish communication protocols? Let them speak, Zephyrak decided. Their surrender will serve as an example to the next world we encounter. The main view screen flickered to life, revealing Admiral Thorne's composed features. Zephyrak was momentarily surprised by the human's demeanor. There was no groveling, no tears, just a quiet dignity that seemed oddly familiar. I am Admiral Kalen Thorne, speaking on behalf of the governments of Earth, the human began. We acknowledge your superior technology and military capabilities. However, we request the opportunity to discuss terms before any further action is taken. Zephyrak's mandibles clicked again, though this time with genuine interest rather than amusement. I am Commander Zephyrak of the Hegemony Fleet. Your request for terms is quaint. You are in no position to negotiate. Perhaps not, Thorne conceded, but we are in a position to make your occupation either simple or extremely costly. We've studied your attack patterns, Commander. You're avoiding civilian casualties wherever possible. This suggests your goals extend beyond mere conquest. The observation was more astute than Zephyrak had expected. The hegemony did indeed prefer to harvest intact populations rather than rule over graveyards. Living beings were useful for labor, for genetic diversity, for cultural knowledge that could be exploited. Dead ones served no purpose. You will surrender unconditionally, Zephyrak stated. Your military forces will stand down, your governments will dissolve, and your population will be relocated to designated zones for processing. In return, we will ensure minimal casualties during the transition. Thorne's expression never wavered. I'm afraid that's unacceptable, Commander. We propose an alternative. Withdraw your forces and we'll forget this unfortunate misunderstanding ever occurred. The bridge of the Dominion's edge fell silent. Several of Zephyrak's officers turned to stare at the human on the screen, uncertain if they had heard correctly. The audacity was breathtaking. A species that had barely achieved spaceflight was threatening beings who had conquered half the galaxy. You refuse? Zephyrak's voice carried a note of genuine disbelief. We do, Thorne confirmed. And before you respond with another demonstration of your firepower, consider this. Every minute you spend in our system is a minute your enemies elsewhere can use to consolidate their positions. Every resource you expend here is one you can't use in your next campaign. We may be primitive by your standards, Commander, but we're not stupid. We know you wouldn't have come this far just to destroy an empty world. Far below the diplomatic theater playing out in orbit, Engineer Davenport worked frantically in a converted subway tunnel beneath New York City. The makeshift laboratory was a chaos of salvaged electronics, improvised weapons, and theoretical physics equations scrawled across every available surface. Around him, a team of scientists and military engineers labored to transform humanity's primitive technology into something that might actually hurt their invaders. The plasma residue from their first strikes, Core muttered to himself as he analyzed samples under a jury-rigged spectrometer. It's coherent energy, but there's a frequency modulation pattern. If we can map the wavelength. Dr. Sarah Chin, formerly of MIT and now one of humanity's best hopes for survival, looked up from her own workstation. Davin, even if we can identify their weapon frequencies, how does that help us? We can't exactly build plasma cannons in a subway tunnel. Core's eyes lit up with manic inspiration. We don't need to build their weapons, Sarah. We just need to understand their principles. Every energy field has a harmonic frequency. Every shield has a resonance point. And every system, no matter how advanced, has exploitable weaknesses. Back in orbit, Commander Zephyrak terminated the communication link with growing irritation. The human leader's words had struck uncomfortably close to truth. The hegemony was indeed stretched thin across multiple fronts, and the council had given him a strict timeline for this operation. Kexith, he ordered, select a mid-sized population center and demonstrate the consequences of defiance. Something significant but not irreplaceable. Target acquired, Commander. The human city of Denver appears to be a suitable demonstration. As the plasma batteries began their charging cycle, Zephyrak allowed himself a moment of reflection. In all his campaigns, resistance had followed predictable patterns. Initial shock, desperate negotiations, gradual acceptance, and finally submission. These humans seemed determined to skip several steps in that progression, and their leader's calm defiance was genuinely unsettling. Perhaps they simply didn't understand what they were facing. Soon enough they would learn. The second plasma strike would tell him everything he needed to know about humanity's resolve. The city of Denver had been home to nearly 3 million people when the plasma beam carved a perfect circle 5 miles in diameter through its heart. In less than 30 seconds, the mile-high city became a glowing crater, its citizens simply ceasing to exist as their atoms were torn apart by energies beyond human comprehension. The shockwave rattled windows as far away as Colorado Springs, and the mushroom cloud of vaporized earth and metal could be seen from space. Admiral Thorne stood in the NORAD command center, staring at the satellite footage with eyes that had suddenly aged a decade. Around him, the steady hum of computers and communication equipment seemed muted, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. The tactical displays showed the same devastating reality from a dozen different angles. An entire city gone in the time it took to draw a breath. "Sir," Captain Voss whispered, her voice barely audible above the electronic noise. "We're receiving another transmission from the alien fleet." Thorne straightened his shoulders and composed his features, though inside, his heart felt like it was being crushed by the weight of 3 million souls. "Put him through." Commander Zephyrak's image materialized before them, his crystalline eyes reflecting what might have been satisfaction. "Admiral Thorne, I trust our latest demonstration has clarified your position. Will you now accept our terms?" The silence stretched between the two leaders, each measuring the other across the vast gulf of space and species. Thorne felt the eyes of his staff upon him, felt the weight of 8 billion human lives balanced on his next words. Everything in his military training screamed at him to minimize losses, to preserve what could be preserved, to accept the inevitable. Instead, he heard his own voice saying words that surprised even him. "Commander Zephyrak, your demonstration has indeed clarified something. It has shown us exactly what kind of beings we're dealing with." The answer is still no. The alien's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sound that somehow conveyed both rage and confusion. "You would sacrifice your entire species for pride?" "Not for pride," Thorne replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. "For principle. For the idea that some things are worth more than mere survival. You can kill us all, Commander, but you cannot make us submit." In the farming community of Cedar Falls, Mira Salas held her daughter tighter as the news reports filtered in through emergency broadcasts. The images of Denver's destruction played across their small television screen, but Elena had mercifully fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder. Mira found herself thinking about the nurse's oath she had taken so many years ago. First, do no harm. How did that apply when harm was coming for everyone she loved? The local emergency coordinator, a retired Marine named Buck Williams, had organized the town's response with military efficiency. The grain silos had been converted into makeshift shelters, the high school gymnasium became a medical station, and every hunting rifle in 3 counties had been gathered into a central armory that everyone understood was utterly inadequate for the threat they faced. "Mira," Buck said quietly, settling into the chair beside her in the community center. "I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer. If they come here, if they try to take us." He paused, his weathered hands folding in his lap. "How far are you willing to go to protect Elena?" Mira looked down at her sleeping daughter, at the small face that held her entire universe. "As far as necessary," she whispered. "Whatever it takes." Meanwhile, in the converted subway laboratory beneath New York, engineer Davin Core had been working without sleep for 18 hours straight. His team had grown from a dozen desperate scientists to nearly 100 volunteers. Physicists, chemists, electrical engineers, even a few hackers who claimed they could reprogram reality if given enough coffee and spite. Dr. Chin approached his workstation with a steaming cup of what had once been coffee but now resembled industrial lubricant. "Davin, you need to rest. You're no good to anyone if you collapse." "Can't rest," Core mumbled, his eyes bloodshot but burning with manic energy. "I'm close, Sarah. I can feel it. They're energy weapons, they're using controlled plasma containment, but the magnetic bottle has to be tuned to specific frequencies. If we can generate a matching field. Even if you can disrupt their weapons, how do we deliver it? We don't have anything that can reach orbital altitude." Core's laugh had an edge of hysteria. "We don't need to reach orbit. We just need to make them come down to us." On the bridge of the Dominion's edge, Commander Zephyrak found himself facing a problem he had never encountered in 3 centuries of conquest. The humans' continued refusal to surrender was not just unexpected, it was actively dangerous to hegemony doctrine. Word of a successful resistance could spread to other worlds, inspiring similar defiance. The Council would not tolerate such a precedent. Navigator Tyson approached his command station with visible hesitation. "Commander, we're receiving status reports from the outer picket ships. The humans have begun launching what appear to be suicide attacks." "Explain." "Small craft, primarily civilian vessels loaded with chemical explosives. They're attempting ramming maneuvers against our destroyers. The damage is negligible, but..." She paused, her biomechanical implants processing data streams. "The pattern is spreading. Every major population center is launching similar attacks." Zephyrak's attention turned to the tactical display, where hundreds of small contacts were indeed racing upward from Earth's surface. Pleasure craft, cargo haulers, even atmospheric aircraft modified with crude rocket boosters. All of them accelerating toward his fleet with the single-minded purpose of insects flying into a flame. Weapons Officer Kexitha's 4 arms moved across his controls with practiced precision. "Shall I engage point defense systems, Commander?" "Do it." The space around Earth lit up with defensive fire as the hegemony fleet's automated weapons tracked and destroyed the incoming kamikaze vessels. Each death was quick and clean, a brief flash of light as chemical explosives met energy shields, then nothing. But for every ship destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. "Commander," Tyson reported, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been respect. "Preliminary analysis suggests the humans are using these attacks as reconnaissance. They're testing our defensive patterns, mapping our response times." Zephyrak stared at the tactical display, watching the constant stream of human ships racing to their deaths against his shields. In 3 centuries of conquest, he had seen fear, desperation, even heroic last stands. But this was different. This was systematic, calculated sacrifice in service of a larger strategy. The humans weren't just dying, they were learning. "How long until the next wave of reinforcements arrives from the core worlds?" he asked. 6 local months, minimum, Tyson replied. 6 months. 6 months to subdue a species that seemed determined to make every day of occupation cost more than the last. Zephyrak began to understand why the Council had assigned such a large fleet to what should have been a simple harvest mission. The humans were teaching him that there was a difference between winning a battle and ending a war. 3 weeks had passed since the first alien transmission, and Earth had transformed into a world at war unlike anything in human history. Cities that hadn't been reduced to glass continued to launch their desperate suicide missions into orbit, while in countless hidden bunkers and subway tunnels, scientists and engineers worked with the frantic energy of the condemned to find some way to hurt their technologically superior enemies. Admiral Thorne stood in the relocated command center, now buried beneath the Rocky Mountains in a facility that had once been designed to survive nuclear war but felt inadequate against the forces arrayed above them. The constant stream of casualty reports had become a background drone that he'd learned to tune out, but the number that haunted him was burned into his memory, 47 million and counting. "Sir," Captain Voss announced from her position at the communications array, "we're receiving another transmission from the alien commander." Thorne nodded grimly. These conversations had become a daily ritual, each one a careful dance of psychological warfare between 2 leaders who were beginning to understand each other far better than either would have preferred. Commander Zephyrak's image materialized with the same crystalline clarity as always, but Thorne's experienced eye caught subtle signs of strain in the alien's posture. If humanity was bleeding, at least they weren't bleeding alone. "Admiral," Zephyrak began, his mandibles clicking in what Thorne had learned indicated frustration. "Your species' continued resistance serves no purpose beyond prolonging suffering." My fleet has orbital supremacy, your largest cities lie in ruins, and your primitive weapons cannot penetrate our defenses. Yet still you persist in these theatrical gestures. Theatrical? Thorn's voice carried a dangerous edge. Commander, every one of those gestures carries people who have chosen to die on their feet rather than live on their knees. If you consider that theater, then perhaps you don't understand humans as well as you think. I understand enough, Zephyrak replied. I understand that your leaders are willing to sacrifice millions for the sake of pride. How many more must die before you accept reality? Thorn leaned forward, his weathered face filling the transmission screen. How many more of your ships can you afford to lose, Commander? Yes, we're bleeding. But so are you. Every day we hold out is another day your enemies elsewhere have to consolidate their positions. Every resource you expend here is one you can't use somewhere else. The question isn't how many more humans will die, it's how long your superiors will tolerate a campaign that was supposed to be over in days. The communication link went silent for a long moment, and Thorn allowed himself a small smile. He'd struck a nerve. In the depths of the New York subway system, Engineer Davenport finally allowed himself to collapse into a salvaged office chair, his body trembling with exhaustion and stimulants. Around him, the laboratory hummed with activity as his expanded team of volunteers worked around the clock on their desperate project. Dr. Chin approached with what had become their standard meeting, a status report and a cup of something that might once have been coffee. Talk to me, Davin. Please tell me you have good news. Kor's bloodshot eyes focused on her with effort. I have news. Whether it's good depends on your definition. He gestured weakly toward a complex arrangement of salvaged electronics and jury-rigged components that filled most of the tunnel. We've managed to create a localized frequency disruptor based on analysis of their weapon signatures. In theory, it should interfere with their plasma containment systems. In theory? In theory, a lot of things should work that don't, Kor admitted. But we've managed to disrupt their energy signatures in lab conditions. The problem is range and power. We can generate the effect for maybe 30 seconds across a 2-kilometer radius, and then the whole system burns out. Chin stared at the device, her scientific mind racing through the implications. 30 seconds. That's not much time. It's enough, said a new voice from the tunnel entrance. They turned to see Major Torres, one of the military liaisons who had been coordinating with resistance cells across the city. If you can give us 30 seconds without their shields, we can hurt them. The device isn't mobile, Kor protested. Whatever we're going to do, they have to come to us. Torres smiled grimly. Then we make them want to come to us. Meanwhile, in Cedar Falls, Iowa, the transformation of Mira Salas from small-town nurse to resistance leader had surprised everyone, including herself. The community center had become a coordination hub for 3 counties, with farming families trading information about alien patrol patterns and sharing resources with the grim efficiency of people who had always known how to survive when times were hard. Mama, Elena said quietly as she worked beside her mother, sorting medical supplies by the light of battery-powered lanterns. Are the bad people going to come here? Mira paused in her inventory of antibiotics and bandages, looking down at her daughter's serious 7-year-old face. How did you explain to a child that the entire world had become a battlefield? How did you prepare them for a future that might not exist? I don't know, sweetheart, she said honestly. But if they do, we're going to be ready for them. Will we fight them like the people on TV? Mira thought about the suicide attacks that had dominated the news feeds, about the endless streams of civilian spacecraft racing toward their destruction against alien shields. We'll fight them our way, she said finally. Sometimes fighting doesn't mean attacking. Sometimes it means refusing to give up no matter what. Elena nodded solemnly as if this made perfect sense to her child's understanding of the world. Like when you told me about Grandpa in the war? Exactly like that. Myra's voice caught slightly as she remembered her father's stories about surviving behind enemy lines during World War II. He'd never talked much about fighting, mostly about enduring, about small acts of resistance, about maintaining hope when hope seemed impossible. On the bridge of the Dominion's edge, Commander Zephyrak reviewed the latest casualty reports with growing unease. 3 light cruisers had been lost to human kamikaze attacks, not destroyed but damaged enough to require extensive repairs. 2 more had been forced to withdraw from the battle zone due to what the humans called thousand cuts attacks, where swarms of small vessels would overwhelm point defenses through sheer numbers. More troubling were the reports from his intelligence officers. The human resistance was becoming more organized, more sophisticated. Initial attacks had been desperate and poorly coordinated, but recent operations showed signs of central planning and tactical innovation. The primitives were learning. Commander, Navigator Tyson reported, "We're receiving priority communications from Hegemony Command. The Council is requesting a status update." Zephyrac's mandibles clicked in irritation. Requesting from the Council was merely a polite way of saying, demanding with extreme prejudice. He had been hoping to present them with a conquered world, not an ongoing siege. Tell them the situation is complex. The local species is proving more resilient than anticipated, but victory remains assured. Shall I mention the timeline concerns? No. Zephyrac's voice carried a note of finality. Not yet. But as he stared down at the blue-green world that continued to defy his fleet, he began to wonder if the timeline was still under his control. The humans had taught him something he hadn't expected to learn, that the space between defeat and surrender could stretch far longer than anyone anticipated. And in that space, anything could happen. 2 months into the siege, the transformed landscape of human resistance had begun to take on a rhythm of its own. The daily suicide attacks had evolved from desperate gestures into precisely coordinated strikes, each one designed to test specific aspects of alien defenses while gathering intelligence for the next wave. What had begun as chaos was slowly transforming into strategy. In the deep bunkers beneath Geneva, Admiral Thorne presided over a war council that would have been unimaginable mere weeks ago. Representatives from every surviving government, military leaders who had never worked together, and scientists who had been theoretical enemies just months before now collaborated with the desperate efficiency of people who understood that failure meant extinction. "The pattern analysis is complete," reported Dr. Anastasia Kovalev, formerly of the Russian Academy of Sciences and now one of humanity's foremost experts on alien technology. "Their fleet rotation schedules are becoming predictable. Every 72 hours, they cycle approximately 15% of their vessels back to what we believe are support positions." General Hassan ibn Rashid, who had once commanded the Middle Eastern Defense Coalition, leaned forward in his chair. "Predictable how? What's the tactical window?" "Approximately 4 hours where their defensive coverage has gaps," Kovalev replied. "Not large gaps, but enough for properly coordinated strikes to penetrate their perimeter." Admiral Thorne studied the holographic displays floating above the conference table, his mind working through the implications. "How confident are we in this assessment?" 87%, Dr. Kovalev answered without hesitation. "The mathematics are solid." 87%. Thorne repeated the number slowly, tasting its weight. In the old world, those odds would have been unacceptable for a major operation. In the new world, they were better than anything they'd had so far. "Very well. Signal all resistance cells. Operation Prometheus is authorized for the next rotation window." Far below the streets of Manhattan, Engineer Davenport had finally achieved something that his sleep-deprived mind insisted was either a breakthrough or a complete psychotic break. The frequency disruptor had been modified, rebuilt, and modified again until it bore little resemblance to its original design. More importantly, they had managed to construct 12 additional units using salvaged components from across the city. "The power requirements are insane," Dr. Chen warned as she reviewed the latest specifications. "We're talking about simultaneously drawing more electricity than the entire subway system used at peak capacity. The moment we activate these things, every power grid in the city is going to collapse." "Good," Kor replied, his eyes bright with manic energy. "When their shields fail, we want them to know exactly where we are. We want them so angry they can't think straight." Major Torres, who had become the de facto military coordinator for the New York Resistance, studied the placement diagrams with a professional soldier's eye for detail. "Davin, this plan assumes they'll respond to the shield disruption by sending down ground forces instead of just glassing the entire city from orbit." "They won't glass us," Kor said with surprising confidence. "Think about it, they've had the capability to sterilize the planet from day one, but they haven't done it. They want something from us, something that requires us to be alive. The moment they resort to pure extermination, they lose whatever they came here to gain." Chin looked up from her calculations. "And if you're wrong?" Kor's laugh had an edge of hysteria that had become disturbingly common in the underground laboratories. "If I'm wrong, we'll be too dead to regret it." In Cedar Falls, Iowa, the transformation of rural America into a resistance stronghold had proceeded with the quiet efficiency that had always characterized farming communities during crisis. Mira Salas found herself coordinating supply lines that stretched across 3 states, managing intelligence networks that would have impressed professional spies, and somehow still finding time to maintain her duties as the local medical coordinator. "Mama," Elena said quietly as they worked together in the converted grain silo that now served as the region's communications hub. "Why do the aliens want to hurt us?" Mira paused in her review of patrol reports, looking down at her daughter who had grown far too serious for a 7-year-old. "I don't think they see it as hurting us, sweetheart. I think they see it as collecting us. Like we might collect samples for study." "But we're not samples," Elena protested with the absolute certainty that only children could muster. "We're people." "Yes, we are." Mira pulled her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her hair that still smelled like the strawberry shampoo from their old life. "And that's what we're fighting to prove." Buck Williams approached their workstation with the measured pace of someone carrying bad news. "Mira, we've got reports from the eastern counties. Alien patrols, ground units this time, not just orbital surveillance. They're setting up what looks like processing centers." Mira felt her blood turn to ice water. Processing for what? Best guess? Sorting the population. Determining who's useful, who's not. Buck's weathered face was grim. "They're starting about 60 miles out, working their way west. At current pace, they'll reach us in about 2 weeks. Then we have 2 weeks to make them regret it," Mira said, her voice carrying a steel that surprised both men. On the bridge of the Dominion's edge, Commander Zephyrak reviewed intelligence reports that painted an increasingly troubling picture. The human resistance had evolved far beyond anything his strategic models had predicted. What had begun as random acts of desperation had transformed into a coordinated insurgency that seemed to adapt faster than his forces could counter. "Commander," Weapons Officer Kexith reported, "we're detecting massive power fluctuations from the human city designated New York. Energy signatures are consistent with their primitive electrical generation systems being overloaded." "Overloaded how?" "Unknown, sir. The pattern suggests deliberate sabotage of their own infrastructure, but the purpose is unclear." Zephyrak's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. The humans had shown a disturbing tendency to destroy their own resources rather than allow them to be captured. It was wasteful, illogical, and somehow deeply unsettling. "Deploy the 47th Ground Regiment," he ordered. "If they're destroying their infrastructure, we need to secure what remains before they render it completely useless." "Sir," Navigator Tyson interjected, "ground deployment was not part of the original operational parameters. The Council's instructions were for orbital pacification only." "The Council's instructions assumed a conventional surrender after the initial demonstration," Zephyrak replied coldly. "The situation has evolved beyond conventional parameters." As the deployment bays opened and the first wave of hegemony ground forces began their descent toward Earth, Zephyrak found himself wondering if he was making a tactical decision or falling into a trap. The humans had proven remarkably adept at turning their apparent weaknesses into unexpected advantages. Below him, 8 billion humans waited with weapons they had built from scraps, strategies they had improvised from desperation, and a determination that defied every model in the hegemony's vast database of conquered species. For the first time in 3 centuries of conquest, Commander Zephyrak began to suspect that he might be the one walking into an ambush. The first hegemony dropships descended through Earth's atmosphere like falling stars, their energy shields creating brilliant contrails as they cut through the dawn sky above Manhattan. From the windows of abandoned skyscrapers, human resistance fighters watched through scavenged optics as the alien craft settled onto the scarred landscape where Central Park had once stood. Each ship was the size of a city block, disgorging troops and equipment with mechanical precision. Engineer Davin Kaur crouched in the subway tunnel beneath the park, his hands hovering over the activation controls for the frequency disruptor array. Around him, 36 volunteers waited in silence. Scientists, electricians, subway workers, and college students who had all volunteered for what everyone understood was likely a suicide mission. "Visual confirmation," whispered Dr. Chin into her radio headset. 12 dropships, approximately 300 alien troops visible, plus what looks like heavy equipment. "Core, they're setting up exactly where your models predicted." Core's finger trembled slightly as it hovered over the activation switch. 6 months ago, he had been designing water treatment systems for municipalities. Now he was about to attempt something that would either change the course of human history or end his life in a spectacular explosion. "Pattern recognition was always my strength," he murmured. "Davin," Chen's voice carried a note of urgency. "They're deploying energy shields around their perimeter. If we're going to do this, it has to be now." Core closed his eyes and pressed the activation switch. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Every light in Manhattan died as the city's power grid overloaded, feeding its entire capacity into the jury-rigged disruptor array. The alien energy shields flickered, sparked, and collapsed like soap bubbles as their containment frequencies were overwhelmed by precisely calibrated interference patterns. For 30 seconds, the most technologically advanced ground forces in the galaxy stood naked under Earth's sky. The human counterattack erupted from every direction simultaneously. From rooftops, subway tunnels, and hidden bunkers, improvised weapons that had been crafted from desperation and spite opened fire on alien troops who had never faced an enemy capable of penetrating their defenses. Molotov cocktails filled with thermite, chemical explosives jury-rigged with metal fragments, and kinetic weapons that fired construction materials at hypersonic speeds, all of it poured down on the hegemony forces in a storm of primitive fury. Major Torres led the ground assault from the ruins of the Museum of Natural History, his small team of volunteers charging across the open ground with weapons that belonged in a museum themselves. "For every human they've killed," he shouted as they closed with alien troops who were frantically attempting to restore their defensive systems. The battle lasted exactly 30 seconds, the limit of the disruptor array's power capacity. When the alien shields reactivated, they revealed a transformed battlefield. Of the 300 hegemony troops that had landed, fewer than half remained combat effective. The others lay scattered across the park, their advanced armor no protection against desperate ingenuity applied with surgical precision. In the aftermath, as emergency power systems began restoring partial lighting to the city, Davin Core stared at his burned-out disruptor array with something approaching religious awe. "It worked," he whispered. "It actually worked." Dr. Chen's voice crackled through the radio from her observation post. "Davin, we need to move. Satellite feeds show more dropships incoming from orbit and they're angry. But the damage was already done." Across the planet, human resistance cells that had been monitoring the Manhattan operation began implementing similar tactics. The technological gap that had seemed insurmountable was suddenly revealed to be vulnerable to the one thing the hegemony had never encountered: an enemy willing to sacrifice everything for a few seconds of tactical advantage. On the bridge of the Dominion's edge, Commander Zephyrax stared at the casualty reports with an expression that his subordinates had never seen before. In 3 centuries of conquest, he had never lost ground forces to a primitive species. The very concept had been relegated to theoretical scenarios that were considered too unlikely to plan for. "How?" he asked quietly. "How did they penetrate our shields?" Navigator Tyson's biomechanical implants pulsed rapidly as she processed the available data. "Analysis suggests they somehow disrupted our energy containment frequencies. The technique is unprecedented." "Impossible," Weapons Officer Kexith protested. "Their technology is centuries behind ours. They can barely achieve orbital flight." "Yet our soldiers are dead," Zephyrax stated with cold finality. "Which means their capabilities have been underestimated." The communications array chimed with an incoming priority transmission from Hegemony Command. Zephyrax accepted the connection with the resignation of someone who knew the conversation would not go well. The image that materialized was that of High Commander Vextal, a being whose species had been among the first to join the hegemony and whose patience for setbacks was legendary for its absence. "Commander Zephyrax, the Council has received your preliminary reports. Explain how a primitive species has managed to inflict casualties on our ground forces." "High Commander, the local species has proven more adaptable than anticipated. They appear to have developed countermeasures to our standard defensive systems." "Countermeasures?" Vextal's voice carried a note of disbelief. "Commander, you are describing a technological impossibility. These beings have barely achieved atomic energy. How can they possibly threaten hegemony forces?" "I cannot explain the technical aspects, High Commander, but the results are undeniable. Our ground operation has suffered 37% casualties, and the humans have demonstrated capabilities that were not present in initial reconnaissance." The silence from the other end of the transmission stretched for long moments. When Vextal spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Commander Zephyrax, you have 72 standard hours to achieve complete planetary pacification. If you cannot accomplish this with your current resources, we will dispatch the siege fleet to implement Protocol 7. The transmission ended, leaving Zephyrax staring at a blank screen. Protocol 7. Complete planetary sterilization followed by atmospheric processing. It was the option reserved for worlds that posed a genuine threat to hegemony expansion, something that had never been applied to a species this primitive. In 72 hours, either humanity would surrender, or Earth would become a lifeless ball of rock. Far below in the bombed ruins of Manhattan, Engineer Davin Core worked frantically to construct a second disruptor array from the charred remains of the first. Around him, Volunteers scavenged components from the wreckage of civilization while radio reports filtered in from resistance cells across the globe. The victory in Central Park had been tactical, but its strategic implications were spreading like wildfire. Davin, Dr. Chen called from her position at the makeshift communication station. We're getting reports from cells worldwide. London, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, Lagos, they're all implementing variations of your disruptor technology. The aliens are taking casualties on every continent. Kor looked up from his work, his face streaked with soot and exhaustion. How long do we have? Unknown. But satellite feeds show significant orbital movement. Something big is coming. As if summoned by her words, Admiral Thorne's voice echoed through the tunnel via emergency broadcast. This is Admiral Kalen Thorne to all resistance cells worldwide. Intelligence indicates the alien fleet is preparing for a final assault. All units are to implement Protocol Defiance immediately. This is not a drill. We have 72 hours to prove that humanity cannot be conquered. In the darkness beneath the ruined city, surrounded by the debris of his old life and the desperate hope of humanity's future, Davin Kor returned to his work. 72 hours to build a miracle from scrap metal and spite. Would have to be enough. 68 hours into humanity's final countdown, the siege fleet arrived from the depths of space. 27 vessels of war unlike anything the hegemony had brought to Earth before, massive, angular constructs designed for the complete annihilation of worlds. They took positions around the planet like mourners at a funeral, their weapon systems charging with the patient inevitability of death itself. Admiral Thorne stood in the command center buried beneath the Colorado Mountains, surrounded by displays that told the story of humanity's last desperate gambit. Every major city still capable of resistance had implemented variations of Kor's frequency disruptor technology. Every man, woman, and child who could hold a weapon had been armed with something improvised from the wreckage of civilization. It was magnificent, hopeless, and utterly human. "Sir," Captain Voss reported, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they faced, "we're receiving transmissions from resistance cells worldwide. All units report ready for final operations." Commander Zephyrak's final offer came exactly at the 70-hour mark, his image appearing on screens across the planet with the same crystalline clarity that had marked their first contact. But now his features carried something that hadn't been there before, a deep, weary respect for the species he was about to exterminate. "People of Earth," he began, his voice carrying to every functioning receiver on the planet, "I am Commander Zephyrak of the Hegemony Fleet. In 2 hours this world will be sterilized by order of the High Council. This is not a decision I have made lightly, nor one that brings me satisfaction. Your species has fought with a courage that will be remembered in our histories long after your sun grows cold." The transmission paused, and for a moment, the alien commander seemed to be struggling with something approaching emotion. "However, I am authorized to offer final terms. Any human settlements that surrender unconditionally in the next 90 minutes will be spared. You will be relocated to designated worlds where you can live out your lives in peace. This is the last mercy that will be offered." The response came not from any government or military leader, but from an unexpected source. In Cedar Falls, Iowa, Mira Salas stepped before a hastily assembled camera in the community center, her 7-year-old daughter Elena standing beside her with the solemn dignity of someone far beyond her years. "Commander Zephyrak," Mira began, her voice carrying across the airwaves to reach every corner of the globe, "I'm Mira Salas. I'm a nurse, a mother, and a human being. I speak for my daughter, for my community, and for everyone who believes that some things are worth more than survival." She paused, her arms settling around Elena's shoulders in a gesture that somehow conveyed the entirety of humanity's defiance. "You've shown us your technology, your power, your ability to destroy everything we've built. But you haven't understood what you're really fighting. You're not fighting our weapons or our ships or our governments. You're fighting the idea that people should be free to choose their own fate, even if that choice is death." Elena stepped forward, her child's voice carrying with startling clarity across the broadcast networks. "Mr. Alien Commander, my mama says you want to take us away from our home. But this is where we belong. This is where our families are buried, where our memories live, where we learn to love each other. You can destroy our cities and our ships, but you can't destroy the part of us that makes us human." As the transmission ended, something unprecedented happened across the globe. From the ruins of bombed cities to remote farming communities, from survivors huddled in mountain caves to resistance fighters in subway tunnels, the response was the same: silence. Not the silence of surrender, but the quiet dignity of people who had made their choice and would abide by its consequences. In the final hour, Engineer Davin Core stood in the heart of his greatest creation, a frequency disruptor array that stretched for miles beneath Manhattan, powered by every remaining energy source in the city. Around him, thousands of volunteers worked with the desperate precision of people who knew they were building humanity's last gesture of defiance. Davin, Dr. Chin called from her position at the master control console, "The orbital bombardment is beginning. We have maybe 10 minutes before they reach the city." Above them, the sky lit up with the first strikes of the siege fleet's weapons. Entire mountain ranges simply ceased to exist, vaporized by energies that could have powered human civilization for centuries. But the bombardment was systematic, methodical. They were working their way across the globe, giving each population center time to see their fate approaching and reconsider their choice. "Is it ready?" Chen asked. Core's hands moved across the activation controls with the reverence of someone touching something sacred. "It's ready? But Sarah, you understand what this will do? The power requirements will kill everyone in the facility. There's no coming back from this." Around them, thousands of volunteers stood at their stations. Former enemies who had become allies, strangers who had become family, ordinary people who had chosen to become extraordinary in humanity's final hour. Not one of them moved to leave. "For Elena," Chin said quietly, referencing the little girl whose words had somehow become humanity's final testament. "For all of them," Core agreed. As the alien bombardment reached the outskirts of Manhattan, Davin Core activated the largest frequency disruptor ever built. The effect was instantaneous and planetary in scope. Every hegemony ship in Earth's orbital space suddenly found their energy systems fluctuating wildly as precisely calibrated interference patterns overwhelmed their containment fields. 4:47 seconds, the most advanced fleet in galactic history was vulnerable. Across the planet, the response was immediate. Every remaining human weapon, from improvised chemical explosives to kinetic projectiles fired from makeshift railguns, reached toward the momentarily defenseless ships. The bombardment that had been systematically destroying Earth's surface faltered as alien crews struggled to restore their defensive systems. When the disruptor array finally overloaded and died, taking with it everyone who had built and operated it, the siege fleet had suffered catastrophic damage. 7 ships had been destroyed outright, 12 more were crippled beyond immediate repair, and the rest bore scars that would take months to heal. But Earth was dying. The bombardment resumed with mechanical precision, carving away everything that had ever made the planet home to 8 billion human souls. Cities, forests, oceans, all of it disappearing into clouds of superheated vapor that would take decades to settle. On the bridge of the Dominion's edge, Commander Zephyrak watched the destruction with something that might have been grief. The humans had fought until the literal end, sacrificing everything for the simple principle that freedom was worth more than life. In 3 centuries of conquest, he had never encountered anything like it. "Commander," Navigator Tyson reported quietly, "the bombardment is complete. All human population centers have been neutralized." "And the survivors?" "Scattered groups in remote areas. Perhaps a few 100,000 individuals at most. Without infrastructure or technology, they pose no threat to future operations." Zephyrak nodded slowly, his crystalline eyes reflecting the dying light of humanity's world. "Mark this system as pacified but unsuitable for colonization. The atmospheric damage will take centuries to clear, and the resource cost of reconstruction exceeds projected yields." As the hegemony fleet prepared to depart for their next campaign, leaving behind a world reduced to ash and memory, Commander Zephyrak made one final log entry: species designation, human. Status, extinct. Note for future operations: psychological profile indicates extreme resistance to subjugation. Recommend complete avoidance of species sharing similar characteristics. Conquest cost exceeded strategic value by factor of 12. Some victories are too expensive to achieve. But in the remote mountains of Colorado, in hidden bunkers beneath the ocean floor, in caves and valleys that had escaped the bombardment, humanity endured. Children like Elena learned the stories of the last stand, of Engineer Core's sacrifice, of Admiral Thorne's defiance, of the nurse named Mira who had spoken for all humanity in its final hour. They learned that their species had faced the choice between freedom and survival, and had chosen freedom. They learned that sometimes the greatest victory is not winning, but proving that some things cannot be conquered. And in the depths of space, word began to spread among other worlds in the hegemony's path. There had been a species called humanity that had shown something was possible that no one had believed before. Sometimes, the conquered could make conquest so costly that it became defeat. The humans were gone, but their example remained, A light in the darkness that would inspire other species to ask themselves the same question that humanity had answered with their blood. What is the price of freedom, and is it worth paying? In the end, that question would prove more dangerous to the hegemony than any weapon ever built.